spend some time with the dead.
On demand almost. We'd be like, hey, can you like touch the duck or make it go off? And it would just start lighting up and going crazy.
Why should we be afraid of you?
Hello and welcome to What Goes Bump Tonight. I'm your host, Riley Clark, and alongside me as always is
Trevor Jensen.
And today our special guest is Dr. Michael Caparelli.
Ow.
How you doing today, Michael?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, thanks for coming on to the show. We always appreciate any guest that joins us, and especially someone so
interesting.
Vast and interesting with your experiences, and I'm sure we'll definitely dive into those experiences as we talk about your book that you just recently released.
Yeah, it's been a great journey. Spent over a year and a half with David Berkowitz, also known as the Son of Sam. Met with him for 34 sessions at Shoregun Correctional Facility in Wallkill, New York, and discussed both his crimes back in the 1970s that held the entire New York City in a state of fear, as well as his life behind bars over the last 46 years and some of the amazing transformations that he's experienced.
Yeah, I think out of the interviews I've watched with you talking about David, it seems like his story is actually fairly inspirational for even the acts that he did commit. Like you always want to look at the change in a person, right? Like can people change? That's a question we all ask each other: is can we change? Can we better ourselves? And to see someone like him, seem like they really did, move forward with themselves as a person and focus on becoming a better person.
Most definitely. His story is hopeful. I don't argue that he should ever be released.
Right.
And neither does he. He's 70 years old. He believes he deserves to be right where he's at, but he might as well make the most of his time. And he's certainly tried to the best of his ability, make his days productive and useful. So I definitely have seen some transformation in him. And I paid attention closely. I didn't go into it naive. I am a doctor in behavioral science. I knew what to look for. I've dealt with other inmates. This is the third serial killer that I've had a relationship with. The first two were definitely psychopathic, and any talk of religion was really manipulation. But I can't say that's the case with David Berkowitz. He definitely stood out amongst the inmates that I've worked with.
Huh.
Interesting.
Yeah. So I guess like we could go back a little bit even farther. Like how did you get like put into the position to be able to talk to David? And then what made you like really like want to key on him? And then who were the other inmates that you got to speak with too in your experiences doing this?
Well, it probably goes back to when I was a kid. My dad was in prison. I visited my dad with my mom. In Italian-American families, when dad goes to prison, the euphemism is college. So I remember being about 9 or 10 years old. I said, "Ma, where's dad?" And she said, "We're going to see him in college." And I said, "What's he majoring in?" She said, "Law." So my dad still talks to this day. Here he is, older. I'm older. I'm inching towards 50. And my dad says, when I went to college, I'm like, "Dad, we're beyond that now. We know you weren't in college."
We don't got a fib.
Yeah. So in my neighborhood, my dad kind of had a reputation of being a tough guy, being crazy, but I knew him as dad. I didn't know that persona.
Right.
So I had a certain compassion and empathy towards inmates, probably at a young age. And then at 17 years old, I ended up incarcerated myself. I was a very troubled juvenile. And then while I was incarcerated, I came to faith. It changed my life, faith in God. And then I pursued higher education, was a pastor of a church for many years. That church was involved in prison ministry. So there was always this proclivity towards people in prisons. I had seen David Berkowitz's story at some point, I think on some talk show that they were airing his transformation behind bars. I wrote a book on mental health from a faith-based perspective. I mailed him a copy of the book and just mailed it to him. I've
Yeah.
dealt with so many prisoners, figured maybe it'll inspire him. And within a couple of weeks, wrote me back and said, I was really touched by your book. I'd love to meet
Wow.
you, invited me to come down to the prison. And that began a case study, an analysis of David Berkowitz, the longest ever done on his 46 years in prison. Back in the
Wow.
1980s, a criminologist by the name of Dr. David Abrahamson had conducted a 50-hour analysis of David, and I doubled that time. So that's where the interest in prisoners came in. As far as the other two serial killers, I wouldn't want to mention their names because it didn't end too positively.
Yeah.
One of them actually tried extorting money from me. It's a long
Of
story,
course.
but
Yeah, of course.
neither one of them would be people that would be known. They're not
Right.
like Ted Bundy names.
Yeah.
But if you're in the Northeast area, you might be familiar with the two. But at some point, it became obvious that the talk of religion was more of a jailhouse conversion. And I can tell you, after sitting with David for 34 sessions, that wasn't the case. He truly feels deep remorse over the 13 shootings, over the 1,400 fires that he lit
That's
all throughout New
insane.
York City, the stabbing. It's something that when he talks about these crimes, it looks like he's deadlifting 300 pounds. There's a vein that protrudes out of his forehead. His eyes fill with tears. I've seen him sob. And I know that there's a genuine remorse that's been experienced by David, which is pretty interesting because they say psychopaths don't change. And he certainly was a psychopath in the 1970s. And the data shows that psychopaths make very little headway in
Yeah.
therapy. So the clinical community would say, if you're a psychopath, that's a pretty stable trait or a pretty stable cluster of traits that doesn't change much. I can only attribute it to some miraculous encounter that he had, in his own words, with the man upstairs that led
Right.
to some real change inside of his heart.
Huh.
Yeah.
So, what other mannerisms did you pick up on? I'll say I'm a piggyback off my wife's question, where it's like it's interesting because like how you said, where they don't like a lot of people that are in his position don't generally feel the remorse, which is very interesting to me because I mean it shows what psychological trauma a child will do to you or just like the environment. But what else is it like for him on a daily basis? Is it always remorseful feeling or is it more or less like he's just come to terms with who he is at this point?
Well, when you sit with somebody for 100 hours, you see a lot, especially when it's spanned out over the course of about 16 months. People say that actions are a good litmus test for character.
Mhm.
There's something better than actions, and that's reactions. Actions, people can fake actions. I mean, Shakespeare said, all the world is a stage where it's players. People put on an act every day.
Yeah.
But reactions are actions in real time. They're actions when a man is caught off guard, unscripted, spontaneous, when he's taken by surprise, when things don't go his way. I've got a chance to see David's reactions, not just his actions.
Mhm.
And that itself is indicative of what's inside of him. I'll give you some examples. I talk about it in my book. You can buy my book, Monster Mirror, on Amazon. It ranked the number one. Was that?
Link down below. We got
Oh,
you.
link down below. Thank you. It ranked the number one true crime new release in October for about 5 days in a row. Sold thousands since, thank God. But the reactions I seen, second chapter, I talk about one particular session. I show up and David had an altercation, a verbal altercation with an inmate.
Mhm.
And the inmate said something very insulting to David. And David was irate, very angry.
Yeah.
I mean, just was not himself. I could tell he was angry from the beginning of the session. He walks into the room. Usually he's very personal with the guards. He knows their names, their stories. They look at him as a pastor. He stops and talks to other inmates. This time he made a beeline to the chair to sit with me. A courtesy smile real quick to the COs. I could tell he's not in good headspace. Typically he settles into the chair like he's
Mhm.
going to eat a meal. This time he's on the edge of the chair. He looks like he's in fight flight mode. He's just not in good headspace. And I said, David, what happened? Are you angry? And I watched him for 3.5 hours navigate through his anger in a way that only someone that is matured and really experienced some growth in character can do. Typically, when
Yeah.
people get angry, when they get angry and they're immature, they externalize, meaning they vent about people, places, things, everything going on around them. But a mature person will self-reflect in a moment of anger. And David was able to kind of peel back the layers of the anger, do some introspection, tell me not just what he was going through, but what was going through him. And that kind of internalizing or self-reflection out loud with someone in a moment of heated rage, to me was a real good indication that David really was not the same person as he was in the 70s. I mean, you just take the criteria of psychopathy and you take those traits one at a time, and I can tell you incidences with David that fly in the face of that criteria for being a psychopath.
Hmm.
Empathy. I mean, the guy knows the names and the stories of so many inmates in the prison and their struggles, and he prays for them. He knows
Wow.
the names of people in my life that I tell him about. Very interested in someone when he's talking to them. The ability to own his misdeeds, like not to justify, to dilute, his crimes in any way. Really owns them. In fact, in one of the chapters, he makes some pretty shocking confessions. He makes a confession that he hadn't really talked about in decades to anybody in the book. And, those kinds of reactions really spoke to me volumes about his character change.
Wow, that's amazing. Like I think when we think of someone who, murdered people, we tend to think of someone who doesn't value the life of others or even the emotions of others. They don't care about them, right?
The
So
inhibitors
like
are
to be able
gone.
to see someone who is clearly a psychopath, the way he processes things, the way he did process things, but to see the development and change in his character to now where he shows the empathy in others and being like, wow, this person's having a really hard time. I wish they wouldn't be facing these trials and tribulations and understanding that like having someone's back or being for them in faith and uh catering to other people's needs is just as important for yourself as it is to others.
Most definitely. And if you go back to 1977, David Berkowitz was hardly empathetic
Yeah.
and very manipulative and very predatory. So it's not to at all say he wasn't that person. It's just to say, wow, look at this contrast. And that's what we spent a lot of time talking about too. Was where were you in 1977? What was
Yeah,
going
was it
on in your head?
psychosis? Like what like what mind state were you in? Like what and like that's the thing that always drives me too is like what about true crime is so interesting? And the fact is like he and I probably aren't too different. We have a lot of similarities. These are normal people just like me and you. But why is the stop gone? What type of headspace do you have to be in to be able to do that? And then you hear of all these other people that can mutilate bodies and things like that. I can't. There's no way. So it's like it baffles my mind that it's like you can see the growth from the psychosis state he was in till now. It's like, wow.
Mm. As far as who and who isn't capable of being psychopathic, I think it's an evolution.
Mhm.
It usually begins at a young age. Typically, those children that are diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder, that's the childhood diagnosis that many times morphs into psychopathy.
Mhm.
The clinical term is not psychopathy; it's antisocial personality disorder.
Yeah.
Psychopath is not a clinical term; it's more of a cultural construct.
Yeah.
But it begins early on, and it is an evolution. And I do believe, and this may be a bit controversial, but I do believe that that evolution is possible for anyone. Just spend 6 months mulling over every resentment you have.
Right.
Spend 6 months isolating from the people that care about you, people that love you. Spend 6 months justifying every mistake and wrongdoing you do. Spend 6 months berating yourself continually, shaming yourself, thinking about shaming statements that were made to you. You would be shocked at what you evolve into.
Right.
I think if you study history, you go through, periods of time in Russia Germany, certainly 1940s Germany, you will see Mao China. You will see that mankind has a potentiality for evil. That, you know, in our humanistic society where we sort of see ourselves as wonderful people, we have these delusions of ourselves being good.
Yeah.
We don't really confront, as Jung would call it, the shadow, that darker part of who we are. We're all sort of full of ourselves in this day and age, and we're really canceling everybody else. But the truth is, there's a monster, a potential monster inside everyone, given the right progression of choices. I don't think everyone's capable of becoming a serial killer tomorrow morning, but
Hmm.
it is a slow and steady evolution. It doesn't happen suddenly; it happens subtly. And I think that the potential is within all, more than we even know.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's almost like, I mean, you look back in history, you go all the way back to like BC times or even like past medieval times. Human nature, like we've literally resorted to killing each
It's
other.
escalation
It's
at its
always been
finest.
there. It's never, it isn't like serial killers aren't a new thing. This has always been a thing. We've just
It's a
now,
primal urge, honestly. If you ask me, where it's like it's either like how we said earlier, fight or flight. You know, that's the response that your body gives you. And I don't think that if something escalated, you know, to the point to where
where it's
it
life or
was,
death.
yeah, it was life or death. I think everybody does have the switch, but it just depends on, are you able to, like, mentally, like, with the fortitude to live with that? And that's where I think we can, like, segue a little bit back into, like, some of the questions I see up here is, like, how does David deal with those regrets on a daily basis, knowing that he can't fix that where he's at? You know, like, I don't know if I could do anything. Like, I feel like I would just be a gelatin, like, just a blob where it's like, "I fucked up, dude. Like, what do I do now?"
Well, for us, I say us, meaning David and I, maybe some of your listeners, maybe yourself. The cross of Jesus Christ is an important emblem because it's a reminder of the forgiveness of sins. It doesn't take away the pain and the grief of that he feels for the victims that he's created along the way,
Yeah.
but it does bring him to a place of stability and knowing, okay, because of the cross, I'm forgiven. Doesn't mean I don't face the penalty of what I did. It doesn't mean that I'm not going to have to look at God someday in answer to this, but it does mean I can experience some forgiveness. So the cross is probably his greatest coping mechanism.
Yeah.
He does grieve on a regular basis. I think grieving is appropriate
Right.
considering the damage that he's done. Also, he takes the energy, that angst inside of him, and sublimates it or redirects it into some very productive activities. He gets mail from people around the world. Believe it or not, suicidal teenagers, uh,
Wow.
folks that are at the cusp of destruction. The campus serial killer in Utah about 2 years ago that killed four
Yep.
wrote David Berkowitz 2 letters.
Wow.
People reach out to him because they consider him a place where there's not going to be any judgment. No stones are going to be thrown, um, given his background.
Right.
So he takes that as an honor, and he takes that as an opportunity to somehow redeem himself from the time he spent on the streets making chaos. And he
He's
has been very effective. I mean, he gave me pretty much access to his entire vault behind me on some of these shelves. I've
yeah.
got 1,600 documents that are his psychiatric reports, prison records,
Wow.
letters between him and people, letters between him and the families of victims that have written him. And I see a man trying to reach out and help others as much as possible. He has a real passion for youth
That's
because he knows
insane.
he remembers being 19, 20 years old in such a dark place in his head, and he so badly wants to somehow, save that young David Berkowitz by
Yeah.
helping to minister to some young 19, 20-year-old in the now that's about to commit suicide or homicide.
That's what we say. That's why we realistically love this platform, is because if I can make anybody's day just a little bit
Mm,
brighter and like be a guiding light, and like maybe like this is also a perfect example of a conversation where maybe it changes some perspectives. Like,
mm,
I had no idea that David was capable of being a decent human being after being a complete deprived human being.
mm.
Like, if we would have came into this and I had just the knowledge that I did of his crime and not who he is now, it's like Yeah, my perspective still would have been like he should have been injected a long time ago and he shouldn't be walking this earth at all. But now it's like, yeah, that's that gives me hope that there is
Mm.
a possibility for like a better outcome for everybody. Like granted, none of it should have happened in the first place. No crime should ever happen in the first place, but we live with it every day.
Mm. Well, you know, that my book is not only an analysis of the crimes and what led to those crimes, because I get into great detail on 9 factors that I call a recipe for violence
Yeah.
that were very much at play in David's life. But it's also a book of hope because I focus on the present, and his life now in prison. I'm a peddler of hope. I'm trying to give hope to a culture, a cancel culture that quickly writes people off and says
Oh
they're
yeah.
irredeemable. And I think that that message is so toxic. I think that redemption is possible for anybody. The
I agree
science
with
would
that.
back me up on this. I mean,
Mhm.
neuroplasticity over the last 35 to 40 years, which is an emerging science that has shown the brain can rewire itself, that the neural pathways that, you know, are connected to certain kinds of behaviors that we see in a brain scan, neural pathways can change for the better. So we know through neuroplasticity that a brain can change, and if it can change with one, whether it be an alcoholic or an addict or whatever, it can change with anyone. And I do believe that if we were ever see David Berkowitz's brain in the 1970s on a brain scan somehow, which is impossible, just speaking hypothetically, we were to
Mm.
look at it now, you would see a complete restructuring and rearrangement of neural pathways. I think that there is definitely a change, and the science would back up the fact that we can, as people, we can change. Will we is another question.
Yeah.
Can we? Yes. Will we? Well, the will is the problem.
That
Um,
yeah, that's the big one for me
that's the
too.
big
Where it's
mystery. Most
huh.
people won't change
I,
because
I do you think a lot of people need that, like, I guess, big moment in their life where they have something happen to them that makes them depending on it, you know, it's not going to happen overnight, obviously, but they have this event happen. For me, I'll put my personal experience out there. I had a life-changing illness show up in my life, and it forced me to stop drinking. Well, almost 4 years later, I now look back at myself 4 years ago and realize that I'm such a, I became such a better person because so many life focuses changed after this whole aspect of my life I had to kind of force out, you know? So, like, I think for a lot of people, personally speaking, it takes some type of event, emotion, something that really makes you take a look in the mirror,
Or more
essentially.
structure even is how I look at it too, where it's like if like say military too is a good example where it's like now you have a structured day where everything is set for you to just follow
Yeah,
that path. So it's like I think both of those perspectives, like I think those would help.
yeah, you know, and there's a saying in the clinical community, unless the pain of staying the same becomes greater than the pain of change, people will inevitably stay the same.
Yeah.
So something has to happen to cause pain in staying the same, to cause someone to want to change. Um, Isaac Newton's first law of motion, everything is in inertia. Inertia
Yep.
means stagnation, it's not moving until something from the outside pushes it to move.
Mhm.
So we do, by and large, people do get stuck. I think it's comical when I mean, I've been on 40 talk shows so far, probably around that. And I'm always asked the question, how do you know David's changed? Most inmates don't change. And my response is most people don't change. Never
Mhm.
mind picking on the inmates. Let's talk you. Let's talk me. Most people you meet, you know, they're still cracking the same jokes. You know, they're still stuck with the same habits. To change is truly a miracle, and it's not something that we experience very easily without there being some kind of interruption, some
Yeah.
kind of intervention, some kind of, as you said, something happened, some event. And David Berkowitz would say, you know, being arrested in 1977 was the best thing that ever happened to him. The path that he was going down, nothing was going to stop him. He was on his way the night of his arrest to the Hamptons in Long Island, which is about maybe an hour and a half from the Bronx, to engage in a shootout at a club, take out as many people as possible, and die suicide by cop. They found in the back of his car, of his 1970 yellow Ford Galaxy, they found all sorts of artillery in the back of the car. He
Wow.
was on his way. He said, I was going to end it in a blaze of glory. So David Berkowitz would have been one of the first mass shootouts, probably in history, if he hadn't been arrested, just in the nick of time by the New
Right.
York police, right outside of his apartment. So he's grateful for the arrest. He's grateful for prison. It took that circumstance. He had to come to the end of himself to come to the beginning of God.
Yeah.
And I guess
That's
like
rock bottom.
being a mostly paranormal show, that's always interesting to bring this type of perspective in, because almost weekly we're talking about life and death, right? Like what happens after we die. Do you think before he had this reawakening that he didn't value life at all, or he, was like, death doesn't matter to me, and now is looking like more of like the opposite, to where he sees the value of life and he sees, I don't really even know what to put
It's
behind
so
death,
hard
but
to
like,
word it.
No, I think that nihilistic perspective that you're capturing is correct about David. I think he did get to a point where nihilism had definitely permeated his thought process. Nihilism, Nietzsche's philosophy that everything is meaningless and life has no real intrinsic value. He got to that point of just seeing no value in life, very depressed. And believe it or not, his homicidal mission was actually also a suicidal mission.
Yeah.
He was deeply miserable, and misery doesn't just love company. That's an understatement. Misery demands hostages. Misery takes prisoners. Even Dylan Klebold, whose mother wrote a book on his killing in Columbine, one of
Yep.
the Columbine shooters, she said, I know this is not going to be easy for a lot of people to hear. It's going to sound like I'm making a victim out of my son. And he's obviously a culprit in the situation, but he was deeply depressed. And what he committed in Columbine was not just an act against other people, it was really an act of self destruction against himself. He was going to
Yeah.
go down. He knew it. He wanted to. And he was going to bring down as many people with him as he could. So David was very much a man of self sabotage, as Freud would call it, the Thanatos impulse, which is the impulse to self destruct. That was very much alive inside of him. And his lack of valuing life, his own life and others, was definitely at play. And the opposite, conversely speaking, now there's a great affinity for life, a value for even a life behind bars, and a value for every life that he encounters.
That's so interesting. Cause like this is also just a personal opinion that generally when I look at true crime and anything that has to do with like very, very volatile crimes like his, they're very selfish to like a very core being of themselves, where it's like they're either seeking attention, there's certain stipulations that they're following due to certain like triggers that is just pushing certain buttons for them, and it's always a very selfish reason.
Mm.
But now it seems like from what we're speaking of, it's like, does he give you that selfish vibe? Or like, I know that sounds like funny where it's like I'm a hippie when I say that, but it seems interesting, where it's like, huh, how do you go from being like extremely self-centered and selfish to just like being that like openly, I don't even know what the word I'm looking for is, but I think you understand what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, not to take the heat off of David, but the
Mm,
selfish vibe you're talking about is really common to the entire human race.
that's true, yeah.
Social media is the evidence of that.
Yeah, to an
I mean,
extent for
100%.
everybody.
yeah, I mean, I always say to my psychology students, I'm a professor at 2 colleges. I teach psychology, criminal psychology, abnormal psych. And I always say to my students, I'll say, you think everybody else is the narcissist. But here's the deal. If I take a group photo right now, we all line up for the group photo, and then I show you the photograph, whose face do you go looking for first? And they
Your
laugh.
own. Yeah.
You go looking for your own.
Yep.
And if your hair isn't right, we all got to line up and take the photo again and drop another 50 on the photographer because you don't like the way you look.
Yep.
So, there's such a, I don't know, a sanctimony in our culture, like a self-righteousness, like, this moral high horse that the cancel culture kind of has people on social media. But the reality is that selfishness is in us all. And certainly it's on steroids in people like young David Berkowitz. I
Yeah.
mean, he definitely was a self-centered person to a very violent extreme, but how he has become empathetic and how he's become mindful of the needs of other people, I can only say it's been the grace of God It's been deep involvement in community. He was a very isolated person before this.
Right. Yeah.
Very much a part of the family of God at Shorgunk in the prison. So he doesn't see himself as, a one-man show. He's sort of integrated himself into something bigger and has learned how to dialogue and relate and share and hear and know and be known. And in that process of being in community, it has certainly taught him empathy and has taken him out of himself. Self is a miserable place to stay. I mean,
Yeah.
the data shows that self-consciousness instigates far more neurotic emotion than it does pleasant emotion. Just to think about oneself, it raises anxiety levels. It brings us into depression if we think about it too long. Introspection, although useful, too much of it can be ruinous.
Yeah.
It can certainly induce great neurotic emotion. And
Yeah.
David was very stuck on himself at one point and has learned the joy. He's experienced the joy of coming out of himself and connecting with a world that's around him.
Wow. I mean, that hits home too, because I mean, like, it's very interesting that it's like that's very normal everyday person tendencies, and it's just
Mm,
the very minuscule difference in
mm,
like his story and ours. There wasn't
mm.
much of a course correction or like a change. It's just like it just so happens that like it's funny, like it's almost like that intervention in his life after the fact was needed, but like we have our own trials and tribulations throughout our lives that are different. And it's
Well,
so interesting.
well, look at what is happening in our culture. Let's talk violent crimes. When
Oh
David
yeah.
did what he did, it was an anomaly.
Hmm.
Hmm.
It was just an anomaly. It was like, what happened here? We've never seen this before. Now there are 13 mass shootings a week
Yep.
in the United States of America. 13 a week. Mall shootings, school shootings. You don't hear about them, but
Mm-mm.
there are 13 a week. And the criminal profile keeps expanding. I mean,
Mhm.
it used to be it's this kind of person. You got to look out for that person, the introvert, the hermit, the whatever. Now the profiles, I mean, they just keep growing and expanding. We're going to get to a
Mhm.
point where we realize anybody's capable of anything.
Yeah, even the highly successful people. Like you like
Even highly
I've seen
successful people can happen.
plenty of people that it's like, why would you throw everything you have away
Yes.
for what? A
How many
prison
times do
sentence
you hear
for
the
that?
families say, when it's all said and done after the tragedy, we would have never thought my nephew would
Yeah,
do this or my son?
that one
Uh,
always gets me.
Yeah, and
yeah.
we all have two sides to us. We have the side that we are internally, and we have the side that we are in communication with others. And it's literally the difference into how one reacts to any situation. Are they going to digest it internally and learn upon it and try to adjust themselves, or are they going to react to it negatively and blame it all on themselves and put these emotions into negative actions? Like in the paranormal field, we always, some of the most haunted places are places that a killer lived in or did the murder or whatever, and it's a lot of like those negative actions like get left behind.
Yeah.
So like through our development and everything, like if someone's negative all the time,
It kinda seems like they're imprinting, like, that
Mm,
energy in those
yeah,
certain
thank you.
places. I know
I
exactly what you're
couldn't find the
saying.
words, but I knew you
It's
knew where I
it's
was going with
super it's super interesting to me too, because it's not like everything that we see paranormal is always, like, has to be related to any of these true crime, like, anything or anything like that, but it's always super fascinating that it does seem like when you have this type of traumatic event or, like, something that is so life-changing, that it would make sense to me that if paranormal theory is prevailing and it is correct, it would make a lot of sense that it does stick.
Well, David would tell you that there definitely was, and David's not the only serial killer to
Mm.
talk about this, but there definitely was a paranormal influence behind the crimes. Now, I discuss in the book the relationship between the psychological and the paranormal and the dance between the two, or the interplay or the synergy between the two. So I go into great detail, being a PhD in behavioral science, discussing the psychological, the shame, the isolation, the resentment, the abandonment he experienced, and how that affected him
Yeah.
aggressively. I talk about these things, but then I also talk about how it relates to the paranormal. David says, Mike, when I committed these crimes, it was like an out of the body experience. It was like a power took over, like some predatory force outside of me that preyed on my vulnerabilities. And it's not a devil made me do it kind of thing, because he believes he opened the door for this paranormal energy.
Mm.
You know, it's not like I was a victim, helpless to it.
Yeah, he
No,
wasn't just
I
puppeted.
was resentful. I was very resentful. I was very angry. I was very I made decisions that sort of flirted with the darkness, and it allowed the darkness to take over.
Yeah.
Much like putting a substance in your body. If you do
Mhm.
something stupid when you're under the influence of a substance, you're responsible. Now, we can say the substance played a role, but you also allowed the substance in. So there's a mix there of human responsibility as well as some paranormal factors. And that paranormal energy, Dave is not the only one to speak of that. Ted Bundy, when the FBI interviewed him for 150 hours, he described killing people. He called it an entity, as if it was something foreign outside his body. In fact, the FBI said that when he talked about the crimes, and these were secular FBI agents, these are not like mystics.
Right.
They said that Ted Bundy's blue eyes, his baby blue eyes, mutated into blackness when he discussed the crimes. They said it was the most haunting, chilling experience they had. This is the FBI talking. Dennis Rader, BTK,
Yep.
he called it the X Factor. Jeffrey Dahmer said that he watched The Exorcist. He had a satanic Bible in his home. So the reality of the paranormal, of the supernatural, I think if you spend more time in countries in Africa, other parts of the world, 2/3 of the world still believe in demonic possession.
Yep.
We Americans were very rational. I mean, we're so rational that our heads tilt to the left while we walk down sidewalks. But our rationalism, you can only go so far with rationalism. I mean,
Right.
listen, I'm not an uneducated man. I'm talking to you as a PhD that understands the brain, but I'm going to tell you that there's a point where, something takes over, and you know what? We see it in our own lives. We may not kill somebody, but we act in a certain way, lose our temper, whatever you do
Mhm.
when you lose your temper, punch a wall, kick a cat, whatever you do. And then when you're done and you apologize, you say, I'm sorry. I don't know what got into me. That's interesting phraseology.
Yep.
I'm sorry. I don't know what possessed me to do that. What possessed you?
Right.
Yeah, I don't know. I got carried away. Carried
Yeah.
away. This kind of language insinuates a reality that's beyond the material, that we can tap into that reality. It taps into us, and we come under the influence of something spiritual, just like
Oh
coming
yeah.
under the influence of alcoholic substance or any type of substance.
Yeah. I like to think of it as like when you isolate yourself, you are giving the keys to the kingdom to whatever is inhabiting the space with you, which could be anything. And yes, like if you are practicing dark things, if you are in a negative mind frame, I do think you attract the more negative. But it's one of those things for me too where it's like if we can hear disembodied voices, disembodied footsteps, we have no explanation for any of that. I don't think it's too out of the question that even if it's not, say, demonic, if you're being oppressed by a darker entity that might be like primordial or even a person who is just a like not reformed like a David Berkowitz type, maybe still like a BTK where he's like, I still get my fix from strangling and killing people. I don't know. I do think that it could definitely affect people too.
Yeah, I mean, we are spiritual beings primarily
Mhm.
and physical secondarily. It's hard for us to understand that because we're very concrete in our observations, and
Yeah, we see what we see.
we see the physical.
Mhm.
But there is a spirit that's animating our life. And from a Christian Judeo perspective, I do believe in a realm of light and darkness, evil and good. And your choices in life do sort of entertain one side or the other. David remembers being 5, 6 years old, fascinated with the dark. His mom thought he was outside playing stickball on a Saturday afternoon in the summer, and he's hiding under a bed for 3 hours because he wants to be in the dark. David remembers having an urge come over him to jump in front of subway trains. Have to hold him up against the back wall of the subway station because he felt this urge to jump. He remembers sitting on his 7th or 8th floor fire escape in the Bronx on Westchester Avenue and looking down and contemplating nosediving into the concrete, this strong urge to do it. He remembers punching himself in the head as hard as he possibly could, lighting fires at a young age. And he says, Mike, we could talk psychosis, psychological breakdowns, and I'm not saying that wasn't at play, but I believe in a realm where there's a predatory spirit, like he calls it like a lion in the animal kingdom looking for the gazelle that's injured and preying on that injured gazelle.
Yeah.
That's his description of Satan. And he sees this dialogue he began with the devil at a very young age and sort of joined that side. He even sees the killings when he was committing the crimes as a missionary work of Satan. He saw himself as a messenger of hell. He was fascinated with the movie Rosemary's Baby. Roman Polanski.
Mm-hmm.
It was basically a movie about the offspring of Satan. And he identified as a young kid with that baby. Saw himself as Rosemary's Baby. Fascinated with The Exorcist. Very much into Satanism. Went to a bookstore in New York City called The Magic Child, where he would buy occultic type activities. Even got caught up in a cult in his neighborhood. So David was very drawn to the dark and definitely opened some doors that allowed this kind of thing to sort of take over.
That's so cool. Did he ever confide in you anything that, maybe hadn't been public knowledge before that?
Yeah, well, I don't want to give it away.
No, you're good. You don't have to.
No.
I'm interested.
If you buy the book, you
Mhm.
will find in the end of the book, after much back and forth with David, and after a rapport was developed and some trust, because at first he's a little standoffish.
Sure.
Took some time. He was always friendly, but he was not as open.
I think he's probably aware that you could take advantage of him at this point because he's in a very vulnerable spot.
Yeah, and I gave him my word. I said, whatever I write, you can read it. If you're uncomfortable, I won't put you out there. And he really took some bold steps. He let me publish this book, and it's pretty much a tell-all. And in the end of it, he says some things in the last couple of chapters that are definitely very revealing. And it took a lot of guts on his part to admit some. I'll just stop right there. You can buy the book on Amazon, but I'll tell you what, I don't have a lot of copies. This is an exclusive hard copy edition. You can only buy the paperbacks on Amazon. If you send me an email, I'll have the two brothers here put the email, my email down below, dr.caparrelli@gmail. I'll send you a hard copy for the same price as the paperback on Amazon with my autograph and David Berkowitz's autograph. If you want David's autograph, you don't have to have it, but I'll have both autographs on the book. I'll ship it to your home for the same price that you buy the paperback on Amazon.
That's
worth it.
That's incredible.
Very worth it.
Like we said at the top of the show too, you can get the links down below if you want to take a look at that, or of course, send our man an email here and get yourself a hard copy with his autograph. That's an incredible offer. Thank you for
You're welcome. My pleasure, for sure. I've got about maybe 10 copies. So the first 10 people, it's yours.
Heck yeah, they're gonna be hotcakes. I feel like I know there's a ton of avid readers in this chat. To be completely honest, too.
But I guess like the last question before we let you go for the night, I do have one more question for you.
Sure.
Do you find yourself doing more case studies with more serial killers? I know you say you've already done 3, but you see yourself trying to get to know more of these people and seeing if you can find more change in people.
Yeah, pursue more books.
It would have to be the right story.
Yeah.
I do have someone that you would know right now reading, a very notorious person reading the book. And his particular story has some similar themes as David, and I think is very relevant to our culture.
Mm-hmm.
Very relevant to the times in which we live and some of the issues people are struggling with psychologically. Because my reason is not just entertain people with crime stories. I'm concerned about the mental health crisis in our country. That's my passion. And, being a PhD in behavioral science, having a pastor for many years, that's my heartbeat. So I wouldn't want to tell a story of some guy trying to bloviate about the crimes he committed. This particular person, I don't want to say his name yet, but if he says yes, I'd love to do all over again with him what I did with David, to be able to help some young person that's out there at the cusp of destruction, whether it's suicide, homicide, or both. Have them read a book. They can relate to this particular person. And if this person can come out, they can come out too. I'm a peddler of hope. I want to put hope in the hearts of people that feel very hopeless and in a very dark place in their minds. That's my goal.
I love that.
Absolutely love that. Yeah, mental health is so important, and we want everyone to remember that. If you ever need anyone to talk to,
Reach
we're always
out.
here for you.
Always reach out.
Anyone in the chat, we're all family here, so feel free to let it be known to any of us and confide in us.
The world is a better place with you in it. Always remember that.
100%.
Absolutely. If you have a question from the audience, if you want me to answer it, I don't know if I heard pop up. If there's anything, I'd want to take the time and see if I can accommodate anybody.
I'll say, yeah, if you guys got anything, because we don't want to keep you up. I know you got some things you got to do after this too, so we don't want to hold you up too hard.
No, it's been great. Thank you for what you're doing. I think it's fascinating, the whole realm of paranormal, and our culture of rationalism. America's very Western civilization is very much, logical type creatures. So to open our minds up to another realm, I think is a worthy cause. I would personally recommend, if you don't have a Bible, get in your Bible, because you'll find it can give some real great insights, a timeless manuscript that sheds some light on a very real spiritual realm that's beyond what's in front of us.
All right. Yeah. So those dweebs ask, what was the most shocking thing you've learned in this path you've taken?
It's a great question. I think the most shocking lesson is right in the title. I was expecting to meet a monster, at least in hearing who he was in the 70s. And when I heard about his story in the 70s, instead of meeting a monster, I looked into a mirror. And I realized that the line between the so-called psychopath and me is not that thick. And the line between the psychopath and the general population is not that thick. It's more a line drawn with a dry erasable marker than it is a Sharpie. So I talk in the book. The book is called Monster Mirror. I talk about this similarity between me and David Berkowitz, and how, but for the grace of God, I could have went down that same path. So I humanize a man that is not easy to humanize. That was probably the most shocking conclusion for me is realize how close. Listen, the Genome Project, which is the most long-standing study on people's genetics across the world. I think it took place over like 3 decades or something. The number one conclusion of the Genome Project is that we are all 99% genetically similar.
Yeah.
So we make, our ego makes a big deal about that 1% distinction. We all want to kind of stand out. I'm not like the rest of people, but the facts are we're 99% genetically similar. And I think to focus on some of the similarities, even the themes that I reference in the book are not themes like bedwetting, hurting animals, all the kind of dark triad stuff that you read about when you read about serial killers. I focus on universal themes: shame, isolation, abandonment, something called de-individuation. These are things that you're going to say, wow, I deal with this stuff every day. And I could see if all this stuff came together into a perfect storm and I made some wrong choices, how easily my life could have taken a different path.
Right. Yeah. Whew.
All right. We got a fun one from Mr. Creeper.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the movie Nefarious?
Yeah, I thought it was very well done. Yeah, I think it's still a little bit of a spooky depiction of Satan, in the sense that he's got this sovereign access to us, kind of like jump into somebody pretty easily. I don't know how accurate it was in its depiction of Satan, but man, what a portrayal. The guy who played the killer, I forget the killer's name, if it was Nefarious, maybe it was, but the guy who played the killer and the investigator himself, the reporter, fantastic acting, great one-liners in the movie. I'm just not sure how theologically sound the depiction of Satan is exactly. but good movie.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. So you guys have a great night. Thank you to the audience members. Bless your show, and maybe we'll cross paths again.
Oh,
For sure.
Absolutely love to, Dr. Michael Caparelli. We would
Yeah.
absolutely love to cross paths with you again. Again, make sure you email the man so you can get a hard copy of the book signed by him and David Berkowitz. And if you just want the normal copy, the link is down below. And definitely look him up on YouTube too. He has a bunch of awesome seminars out there that you can watch, and some motivation.
Keep those
that you
eyes
can
out
peel
for the
it.
next stuff to come out too eventually.
Let
I'm
me
sure
just say,
something's in the
let me say
works.
the email one more time. Dr. as in doctor, dr.caparrelli at gmail.com. dr.caparrelli, my spelling is right there, at gmail.com. Email me and I'll have a book shipped out tomorrow.
You guys want that. You need that in your lives.
Definitely do. And with that being said, folks, remember to keep your ears and eyes open where it really goes.
Boom. In the night.
God bless you guys. Thank you.
God bless you.
You're the best. Thank you.